When Time magazine named Albert Einstein Person of the Century in January 2000, they wrote, "He was the iconic 20th century scientist, the bumbling professor with the German accent, a comic cliché in 1,000 films, instantly recognizable like Charlie Chaplin's Little Tramp. Albert Einstein's shaggy-haired visit was as familiar to ordinary people as to the matrons who fluttered about him in salons from Berlin to Hollywood. Yet he was unfathomably profound, the genius among geniuses who discovered merely by thinking about it that the universe was not as it seemed. Even now, scientists marvel at the daring of general relativity. Quote, I still can't see how he thought of it, said the late Richard Feynman, no slouch himself. In addition to his scientific genius, Time also noted his social conscience. Besides campaigning for a ban on nuclear weaponry, he denounced McCarthyism and pleaded for an end to bigotry and racism. Harvard physicist and historian Gerald Holton adds, Einstein's humane and democratic instincts are an ideal political model for the 21st century, embodying the very best of this century, as well as our highest hopes for the next. That was in the Times essay. My guest today, Walter Isaacson, has written a new biography, Einstein, His Life and Universe. But Walter Isaacson also has a career at the highest reaches of mainstream media, and we will talk about that as well. Walter Isaacson is the president and CEO of the Aspen Institute. He's been the chairman and CEO of CNN and the managing editor of Time magazine. He's the author of Benjamin Franklin, An American Life, Kissinger, a biography, co-author of The Wise Men, 6 Friends in the World They Made, and his newest book is Einstein, His Life and Universe. Isaacson began his career at the Sunday Times of London and then the New Orleans Times-Picayune States Item. He joined Time magazine in '78, served as a political correspondent, a national editor, and editor of new media before becoming the managing editor in '96. He became chairman and CEO of CNN in 2001. And then president and CEO of the Aspen Institute in 2003. He was appointed after Hurricane Katrina to be the vice chairman of the Louisiana Recovery Authority, and he is chairman of the board of Teach for America. Welcome, Walter Isaacson.
Thank you, Terrence. It's great to be with you.
I like listeners to get a feel for the people behind the work and the ideas that we talk about. So what moved you originally to become a journalist?
I wanted to become a journalist because I wanted to explore the world. So many different things felt magical to me. I loved science. I loved foreign policy. I loved traveling through Africa. And somebody came from the Sunday Times of London to my college, and I applied for a job and eventually got it, and so moved over to England and started my journalism career there.
Okay. Now, you've written 3 biographies on Benjamin Franklin, Henry Kissinger, and Albert Einstein. How have you chosen those subjects?
I like writing about the way the mind works, and I'm sure, Terrence, on your show, you realize that there are a lot of smart people in this world, that smart people are a dime a dozen, and it's not just being smart in order to be a good person or a significant person. You have to have certain values, you have to be wise, and you have to be creative and rebellious. For Benjamin Franklin, I was looking for that person who had the wisdom to bring people together and to show some common sense. He wasn't the smartest person at those, the Declaration of Independence or Constitutional Convention. You had people like Madison and Jefferson who were probably sharper. But he was the indispensable man, the person with the wisdom to bring everybody together. With Einstein, I was looking for somebody who was rebellious, creative, and imaginative, because I love science, but I think most of us who aren't scientists, we forget how imaginative and creative science can be, and we feel intimidated by it, which we shouldn't.
And what about Kissinger?
Well, Kissinger was very smart, but my feeling was he didn't have a feel for democracy, he didn't have a feel for certain values, and thus he was secretive, and his legacy was, to put it mildly, mixed. And so I was looking at somebody who I think almost even all of his critics would say was intellectually smart, but somehow he failed, and I was looking at why.
There are biographers and there are journalists, and you are both. In researching and writing those biographies, what most surprised you about each of those 3 men?
Well, especially for Franklin and Einstein, we think of them as made of marble or up two-dimensional on posters. And the fact that they were flesh and blood humans with some real flaws. I mean, Franklin was pretty bad to his first wife. Einstein was even worse to his wife, and he was very cold to his kids until he finally reconciles with them. He's trying to do general relativity, which is the greatest and most elegant theory of our time, while he's fighting with his wife over custody of the kids. He's being it's sort of brutal battle. And you realize the human passion and sometimes how personality and science, or personality and your professional life, are all connected.
Okay, let's go back. I would love to hear you also, if you can, the same thing about Franklin and Kissinger, and then we're going to return to that personality and science question with Einstein.
Well, again, with Franklin, it was that flesh and blood quality. Like Einstein, he has horrible fight with his oldest son, and that may seem irrelevant, but both with Franklin and Einstein, it tied in with their professional life and things. With Kissinger, it was the manipulativeness and the secretiveness reinforced by Richard Nixon. There's a good book by Bob Dallek that's just come out that has even more than I did back 15, 20 years ago when I wrote the book. But we all listened to those tapes and read the transcripts, and it was the fact that if you have a good intelligence, but you're manipulative and you're not keyed onto or anchored to certain values, it can be a problem.
We'll go back now to what you said, this connection between Einstein's personality and his scientific achievements. And it really is a thread that weaves its way through the whole book. Speak a bit about that.
Einstein is rebellious to his core. He gets kicked out of school as a little kid for being contemptuous of authority. When he gets to the Zurich Polytech, he's able to tick off all three professors because he challenges them. He refuses even to call them Herr Professor when he's angry with them. And he really does not kowtow to received wisdom. None of them will give him a job recommendation, which is why in 1905, the miracle year when he does some of the great breakthroughs of science, he's merely a third-class examiner in the patent office because he wasn't able to get an academic job. That rebelliousness is what causes him to question every premise, whether it's Newton's premise that time marches on irrespective of our observations of it, or the premises about gravity, or even simple things that you and I wouldn't question, like what does it mean to be simultaneous? What do we mean when we say two events happened at the same time?
I really found that he did not make, as I imagine most scientists do, incremental movement, incremental additions. And what you're saying is because of his question authority, which was him to the core, he made breakthroughs because he just wasn't satisfied with what everyone knew to be true.
He challenged the most basic of all premises. Everybody else is making incremental little improvements or being stumped by conflicts and theories, which was happening in 1905. Einstein just threw out all of the premises. Also, he thought visually. He was a very slow verbal learner, and so he would do things in pictures, like how would you picture a light wave if you looked at Maxwell's equations? Now, he was the one who figured out that you couldn't catch up with the waves of light because Maxwell's equations didn't allow for that. And so this is something other scientists hadn't been able to picture. All of his breakthroughs come from just two things: being able to visualize underlying physical realities and being able to throw out the most basic premises that nobody had even thought of challenging.
Right. When I read that, I was reminded of Buckminster Fuller. In his biography, you learn that he had terrible vision. And until the age of 4 or 5, he saw things sort of fuzzily. And then when he finally got glasses, he could see more clearly. And he felt that early thing of him only seeing fuzzy outlines and not seeing as distinctly as other people was one of the things that led him to be able to see things entirely differently than others.
You know, that's fascinating, because one of the points I try to make in the book is at a time when we're in No Child Left Behind and rigorous education and we're worrying about science and math education, we have to remember that people and kids are imaginative in different ways. Some are verbal, some are pictorial, some have a great visual sense, some challenge authority, and that's a great thing, and obviously there are others who challenge authority and don't know what they're talking about. But we have to be very flexible in how we look for creativity in our kids.
Okay, let's take a couple of minutes here. I know you've been doing interviews, so you've had to answer this question. It would be impossible to, quote, briefly describe Einstein's scientific work and its meaning. But having said that, what can you say about that beyond what you've already said? One of the things that I realize you're saying is that he, by really being the one to challenge some of what had come down to us by then, he actually gives us an entirely view of the universe.
I'll tell you about a letter he writes in 1905 when he's a patent examiner, very impertinent and impudent. He's mad at one of his friends, jokingly, who's gone away and not sent him something. So he writes to Conrad Habeck, and he says, "You frozen whale, you canned piece of sperm, you soul, I'm going to send you a letter of inconsequential babble until you send me your dissertation, but then I'll send you 4 papers in return." And only after that do you realize that in his spare time, just over 2 months, he had written 4 papers that will transform science. He says the first deals with the energy properties of light and is very revolutionary. That was a paper that said light's not just a wave, it's a particle, it's a quanta, and it's a basis of quantum theory. And he says the second paper determines the true size of atoms and molecules. This is before most scientists were absolutely convinced that atoms and molecules existed. But Einstein found out a way to determine their size just by looking at how sugar sort of spreads through water. And then he said he found out how to prove Brownian motion, which is how little things flicker in water, which also proved the existence of molecules and atoms. And he said, in the 4th paper, it's only a rough draft, but it involves a modification of the theory of space and time. And that was, of course, special relativity, in which he says that Newton is wrong, time doesn't just tick-tock along, irrespective of how we observe it. He said, time is relative to your state of motion. If you like that, he was imagining catching up with a light wave. As you try to catch up with a light wave, that light wave travels just as fast, but time slows down for you. This was absolutely revolutionary, and it takes them 17 years before they give him the Nobel Prize because it has upended physics in a way that most people can't comprehend.
And the fact there of, as you said, that time doesn't tick-tock along, is he one of the first to actually see space-time as one reality?
Absolutely. That's part of the special theory of relativity, which is that time is simply a 4th dimension of space. And then he goes on to do general relativity, which is when he says that objects don't attract each other at a distance, the way Newton says when Newton does his theory of gravity. He says that objects merely curve the fabric of space. And he actually says it curves the fabric of space-time, because all 4 dimensions of space-time are curved by an object moving through space.
And that one, the general relativity, took him a great deal of time, and you're writing about his struggle with that one is really quite interesting, and we won't go into it here, but that, as you said, he was a physicist who dealt mostly in these thought experiments, in visualizing reality, while many others approached it mathematically.
They started calling it Jewish science in Germany because they were not, when anti-Semitism was arising, because it seemed not to have a concrete basis in reality. So Einstein said, here's how you can test my theory of gravity and the bending of light. He said, light from a distant star will bend by 1.7 arc seconds as it goes right next to the sun. Now, of course, you can't test that until there's a total eclipse of the sun. But in 1919, there was a total eclipse of the sun. They went out, they photographed the stars, and indeed, they are shifted when the light goes right next to the sun. It became headlines around the world. It was Einstein theory triumphs. And New York Times headline was Lights All Askew in the Heavens. And Einstein suddenly is accepted as having been right.
Okay, so people who want to learn how the human Einstein interacts with these huge questions, the book is Einstein, His Life and Universe. Now, he made his key scientific contributions by his mid to late 30s, correct?
Right, and like a lot of us as we get older, you're really radical. You're willing to throw out all received wisdom and challenge all authority. Suddenly, in his mid-career, he starts resisting the young Turks of physics, those who have developed quantum mechanics and the uncertainty principle. And Einstein doesn't like the uncertainty principle. He says, I cannot believe that God would play dice with the universe, allow things to happen by chance. And it's an interesting lesson for all of us, which is why even an Einstein becomes a little bit more of a defender of the classic order when he gets older. Einstein's answer was, he said, to punish me for my contempt for authority, fate turned me into an authority myself.
Yeah, I think it is actually the most interesting twist in his life, is that he would then turn against what might be the next Einsteins. Now, does he finally reconcile with quantum theory by his death?
Not really. He realizes that quantum mechanics is probably correct in most of what it says, but he believes it's incomplete, meaning there's got to be a bigger theory that makes things more deterministic and restores certainty rather than uncertainty. On his deathbed in Princeton, right before he dies, he's hemorrhaging, but he reaches over to his bedside table and continues to write lines of equations, trying hard for that unified field theory he thought would complete or overcome quantum mechanics and uncertainty.
Okay. Now, after that period, as we said, mid to late 30s, on the one hand, he's becoming a little bit more, as you say, of a conservative in the scientific realm, but he begins to devote much of himself to taking moral and political stands. Any thoughts about how the current administration and the kind of mood of fear they've promoted might have dealt with an outspoken scientist such as Einstein?
Well,
so
sure.
combine that all.
Einstein reacted very strongly against McCarthyism. He felt that people who used fear and tried to suppress free thought, even rebellious free thought, that went against everything that America was about. And Einstein's crusade, not only for racial justice and social justice, but against all forms of McCarthyism and intimidation, that was most deeply felt by him.
Mm-hmm. Now, one other question that I think occurs to a lot of people is, what was his spiritual life, right? Richard Dawkins begins his book, The God Delusion, by making a distinction between what he calls Einstein's God and the supernatural personal God of conventional religion. Where do you come out on all of this?
Einstein indeed believed in a non-personal God, a God who did not intervene or intercede in our lives. As Dawkins said, it's sort of close to being either a deist God or a pantheist, sort of Spinoza's God, whose spirit is manifest, as Einstein said, in all the laws of the universe. I think it kind of depends on whether you count that as a God or not. But Einstein said he hated it when what he called the fanatic atheist said that he didn't believe in God. He just defined God as being the spirit manifest in the laws of the universe rather than as a personal God who we could pray to and say, can you please make it a snow day tomorrow? I didn't do my homework, or that sort of thing.
Exactly. Can I make this foul shot? So, in other words, he's claimed by both sides, right?
He's claimed by both sides, and he resented both sides for claiming him. He said he resented the fanatical atheists more because they seem to not feel the magic and the beauty and the awesome reverential nature of the laws of the universe that he felt. But he also resented it when people said he believed in a personal God.
Right. And as I interviewed Dawkins earlier this year, and he finishes that interview and he finishes one of his books by definitely affirming this awe, this wonder, and this reverence and so on, that even he, who's probably the world's most famous atheist, now experiences.
I think that Einstein says that we all have to have a bit of humility. He says this over and over again in face of such ultimate questions, and that he kind of resisted people who felt they were sure of themselves on these type of questions.
Right. One quote is, the problem involved is too vast for our limited minds. You have had a career at the highest echelons of media, CNN, Time Magazine. Why did you leave it?
Well, I was a little bit disenchanted with cable television news. I felt it was simplifying things, that it, sort of divided people. It was always doing crossfire type things. I felt more comfortable in print. I had been in print my entire life. I had loved magazines, and I wanted to write books. So, and you know what? I wasn't particularly good at TV, I must say.
I'm going to read a quote. You were quoted in the recent Bill Moyers special that took on the media and its, say, dereliction of duty in the run-up to the invasion of Iraq. And one quote from you was, one of the great pressures we're facing in journalism now, it's a lot cheaper to hire thumbsuckers and pundits and have talk shows on the air than actually to have bureaus and reporters. Take it out of your own personal realm. How do you assess the state of the media today? And let me put it in this context. It seems to me democracy is a sham unless we have an informed citizenry. And one of the key roles there is the role of the media. Where do we stand?
I think we're having trouble getting journalism that's based on solid reporting. As I said in that quote, and as I said to Bill Moyers, if you're a big corporation and you own a television network or stuff, if you put on people highly opinionated shouting at each other, it costs about 1/10 of what it does to send somebody to Baghdad or send somebody to Afghanistan, and you get higher ratings. And people are far more opinionated these days, and they like seeking out networks or talk shows or radio shows that agree with their own biases, whether it's Fox or talk radio or whatever it may be. And so I worry about the fact that the media has become more pundits and thumbsuckers and less just shoe leather reporting by somebody who says, let me try to find the facts and see what we know.
Which is how you began your life, how David Halberstam, the late David Halberstam, began his. Take it another step, if you would, Walter. Where do we go from here? How, given the realities, and let me just mention the other reality, which is that newspapers, challenged in their circulation by the younger audience not signing up, people taking it online instead, are cutting back. And as someone said recently, you know, all those websites with all those wonderful free articles, the reporters, the investigators that they depend on work for the newspapers. How are we going to fix this? How can we regain? You're here at the Aspen Institute. Let me just read. Dedicated to fostering enlightened leadership, open-minded dialogue, appreciation for timeless values. How are we going to inform the citizenry?
Well, I do think there's a problem with the Internet, everything being totally for free, so that somebody whose opinions and blogging, and it doesn't really cost them anything to do it, is there giving away stuff for free. And then a newspaper that actually sends somebody, whether it's off to war or to Washington or any place else to do solid reporting, that costs a lot of money, but everything's supposed to be free on the Internet. I often felt that it would be a better world if people were willing to say, I trust this outlet, I care about this, I'm going to subscribe to this newspaper, because the people they're going to hire to do the reporting are going to need to pay the rent, they're going to need to, put their kids through college and stuff. I don't know how you're going to have a great media if everything is supposed to be free, because then you'll never do the expensive stuff like solid reporting.
So you were managing editor of one of the most influential magazines and then head of one of the most powerful cable networks, news networks. You've left that, and now at Aspen you're looking at a bigger picture, correct?
Yeah, well, we're trying to do things that can help around the world in just a variety of ways where we think we can do good.
And how do you and the folks you deal with in that kind of an area, how do they assess democracy? And if you want to speak here about the fact that I believe that the run-up to the war, the recent renewed revelations of Jessica Lynch and Corporal Tillman's false stories and all of this, that we are in a very dangerous state now where propaganda becomes easier and easier to propagate because there's less leverage by the educated, credible media and less discernment by the people. How are we going to solve this? And I notice you're also chair of the board of Teach for America, so obviously education is something that's crucial to you as well.
Well, let me try to get to all of those things. Einstein, at the end of his life, thought America was spinning out of control with McCarthyism and the, Red Scare and people propagandizing and people challenging people's patriotism. And then American democracy righted itself. Even in Eisenhower and Edward R. Murrow comes along. The Army, shoots down McCarthy. And Einstein said, well, there's a nice gyroscope in the American democracy. It tends to right itself. I actually believe that's the case now. I mean, you've seen all those things you've talked about, but just this past week we've had hearings about, the Army cover-up. We've had hearings about the war. We've had Bill Moyers expose even people like myself who were not diligent enough in questioning the intelligence. George Tenet's book comes out next week and does, mea culpas and blames Cheney and everything else. American democracy, I think, has the power to right itself, but it takes a while. Sometimes you need to change parties. Sometimes you need to have Congress in a different party from the presidency. But I've always suspected that, historically, it's always righted itself, and it seems that's the way we're going right now.
You mentioned before that there are many different kinds of intelligence, and intelligence shows up differently in different children and different folks. It struck me in some of my more wild moments that intelligence itself is under attack, that it has been disparaged. It's been treated as if it's effete, as if it's not good for the common people. One of my thoughts is it's because intelligence so often allows itself to be treated as just cognitive, and that we who might want intelligence to triumph need to come up with a more robust intelligence that's emotional, intuitive, physical, etc. Your thoughts?
That's exactly why I wrote this book. It's nice to celebrate great minds and to show that they're intuitive, creative, imaginative, and beautiful, the way Einstein's mind was. And to get back to Teach for America, if we have a two-tiered educational system where a lot of your listeners, their kids get great educations, but we have other people just put in underperforming schools that aren't working, we're not going to be able to celebrate the fact that we as a nation appreciate intelligence and appreciate creativity when it goes with intelligence.
Okay. The book, again, is Einstein, His Life and Universe. Thank you, Walter Isaacson, and keep up your good work.
Thank you, Terrence.